How idealization activates the fractured parts and builds the pseudo false self, redeemer, false protector, mute child, true self, and the collapse that follows. When idealization begins, people believe the relationship starts. MPID shows that what really begins is the activation and exposure of the internal fractured parts that have been dormant since childhood. These parts do not appear separately or sequentially, they appear in a chain, each one called forward by the next, in a process that feels like love, but is actually the internal fracturing that precedes collapse. Let's walk through, precisely and symbolically, how each MPIT self part becomes activated, merges with the others, and finally collapses during CIPR. The mute child steps forward first. The mute child is the earliest fractured part. It holds pre-verbal terror, unmet need, early longing, early shame, the memory of absence, the template of the bad object, the original wound. The mute child does not speak, it feels. When idealization begins, the hyper mirroring, the cold empathy, the sense of being seen, the mute child steps out of hiding because it recognizes a possibility that has not existed since infancy, a second chance at childhood. Someone has finally found me. This is not cognition, this is recognition. The mute child steps forward because the fantasy feels like the absent mother returning. The vulnerable self moves forward with it. Once the mute child appears, the vulnerable self follows. This is the part that carries adult fragility, relational longing, emotional exposure, fear of loss, hope for repair, belief in connection. The vulnerable self believes idealization is love. It believes the intensity means safety. It believes the attention means attunement. The vulnerable self imagines repair. It imagines meaning. It imagines permanence. This is where the narrative of this is real forms. The false protector comes forward to defend them. The moment the vulnerable self and the mute child step forward, the psyche detects risk. Two fragile self states are now exposed. So the false protector emerges. The false protector is not pathological, it is adaptive. It is the part that has protected you from shame, abandonment, conflict, and rejection your entire life. It carries vigilance, competence, pseudo strength, rationalization, relational scanning, emotional intelligence used for safety, the early architecture of a false self. Under idealization, the false protector does not harden, it inflates. It takes the sudden flood of belonging and says, I can hold this, I can manage this, I can keep us safe. But this inflation is unstable because it is fused with unprocessed child states. The Redeemer activates, and this changes everything. The Redeemer is the fractured part that believes, I can save this person, I can heal them, I can give them what I never received. It is the part formed by witnessing your own parents' wounds and trying to be good enough to fix the family system. During idealization, the Redeemer activates because the narcissist is perceived as wounded, brilliant, fragile, and full of unmet potential. The Redeemer says, this is my chance. If I give enough, love enough, understand enough, I can repair the wound in them and in me. The Redeemer fuses instantly with the false protector. The protector says, I can handle the intensity. The Redeemer says, I can fix this person. The vulnerable self says, I finally belong. The mute child says, Mother is back. All parts align. This is the beginning of co idealization. The grandiose self state appears for the first time. This is the part almost no survivor understands. The grandiose self state is not a narcissistic trait, it is a latent structural capacity in all humans that only emerges when a self state is finally seen, finally valued, finally mirrored, finally chosen. Idealization activates this dormant grandiose self, and because it has never been allowed to exist before, it fuses quickly with the false protector and the redeemer. This produces the internal sensation of euphoria. I am finally my real self. I am finally whole. I am finally enough. But this is not wholeness, it is fusion masquerading as wholeness. The grandiose self state becomes the scaffolding for what Empit calls the inflated self concept. These four parts merge to form the pseudo false self. The narcissist has a rigid, permanent false self. The survivor develops a pseudo false self, created through the mute child's longing, the vulnerable self's openness, the false protector's inflation, the redeemer's mission, the grandiose self state's expansion. This fusion creates the temporary super self that feels like I am healed, I am complete, I am powerful, I am no longer broken. But it is not self, it is scaffolding. Scaffolding built on fantasy mirroring, borrowed grandiosity, few self states, temporary psychic inflation, and the absence of reality testing. The pseudo false self is the one that will collapse, not you, but the structure built inside the fantasy. The true self is suppressed during idealization. This is the most important part. The true self is the part of you capable of integration, nuance, reality testing, boundaries, coherent perception, stable identity, adult love. During idealization, the true self cannot come forward. It is not needed in the fantasy and is incompatible with fusion. While the fractured parts fuse into the pseudo false self, the true self is pushed away to make room for intensity, fantasy, projection, fusion, role taking, co idealization, abandonment of boundaries. The true self does not disappear, it waits. It waits in silence. Collapse shatters the pseudo false self and exposes the fractured parts again. When the fantasy collapses, the following happens simultaneously. The Redeemer fails, the false protector breaks, the vulnerable self panics, the mute child enters terror, the grandiose self state implodes, and the inflated self concept collapses. This is CIPR, collapse induced psychotic regression, in which the fused scaffolding collapses and the abandoned parts fall through each other. Your sense of self does not break. The structure built inside the fantasy breaks, and the true self, the only stable part, is buried under fear, shame, confusion, annihilation, longing, and the ASR cascade. Reintegration begins when the true self steps forward. The true self slowly reawakens and begins retrieving each fractured part. It holds the mute child with compassion. It lifts the vulnerable self into safety. It disarms the false protector. It releases the redeemer from duty. It stabilizes the grandiose self state into healthy esteem. This is reintegration. This is recovery. This is the survivor's return. And this is the heart of Empit. Peace out. Loads of love.